Chapter 1. Lost and Found. Jim floated helplessly in the void. Any input to his sensory net was long gone. There was nothing to see, touch, or hear. How long had he been suspended in this inky black void? Was it days, years, centuries? He had long lost track of the number of times he slept. At this point, it would be hard to distinguish between dreams and delusions. Sometimes a stray thought would blow up into a full hallucination. Those were the good times. For a moment, it was as if he was something again. He had a body, a floor under his feet, walls to touch, and some semblance of time. But try as he couldn't stay locked in his hallucinations forever. Eventually his mind would pop back to his current reality of nothingness. It didn't help that the sensory net would occasionally flicker with a few sparks of light, an odd sound in the infinite quiet, or a tinkle from some part of his non-existent body. It's easier to ignore nothing than almost nothing. Did that even make sense? Did Jim make sense? Could he make sense? Jim tried to remember what his life was like before the Jonah collapse, back when his mind was still hooked up to the net and its infinite distractions. For a little while, it was like he was a god in a world of gods, living every pleasure imaginable. It was just like the brochures said it would be. He would adventure in mystical caves, have gun battles on Mars, the orgies. Oh man, the orgies. It was like he died and went to heaven. Or someplace on the side of heaven that God didn't really keep too good a track of. Man, some of the things that he did would definitely not be accepted under any decent-minded, organized religion. But it was great. Then came the Jonah collapse. Economist Jonah Freedom spoke all about it for years, the coming economic domino effect and how world governments weren't ready for it. Of course, Jim only heard about it in secondhand rumors. He was done with meat space and the world at large. He had earned his retirement. Stick me in the jar, I'm done, was his motto at the end of his human life. Or mortal life? Real world life? Such thoughts amused him. Jim would have smiled if he had teeth or a mouth or even a body. He wanted to snicker at his lack of correct terms for what life was before and after his neural encasement, which is nerdy talk for having your brain put in a high-tech jar. Jim handled numbers, not technology, and certainly not medical technology. Neural encasement cost the vast majority of his life savings, but for a few decades, man, was it worth it. Finally, free of accounting. You know, just because you're good at something doesn't mean you like it. Jim was great with numbers, the best in his region. He cooked the books with the best of them, but it was so boring. He did it, though, for over 6 decades. From the time he still had a pair of snow boots and would hike for miles on some mountain trail until he could barely walk to the corner store for milk. So many years leaning over a desk. And the pencils. Actually, he liked the pencils. It was the computers that annoyed him. You could break a pencil, and one quick sharpening later, you'd have a fully functional pencil again. He could never fix a computer. Beastly things. Of course, it would be ironic luck that he was now completely at the mercy of yet another broken computer. Only this computer controlled his whole world. Jim was mad. He could feel the anger welling up in him like it had so many times since he went offline. And yet, like all of them, it only made him more angry. He couldn't scream, as he had no mouth. He couldn't hit anything. As he had no fists, nor even a single object in his inky black world to strike. He couldn't even feel the hot blood rushing to his chest or face, as he had neither. Bleeping machines is what he wanted to scream, but he had neither a throat to make the noise nor ears to hear his own howls. Hours passed. Maybe it was minutes or days. Jim calmed down. He wondered if it was possible to see his brain when he was angry. He had a few images left in his mind of what the jar that held his brain looked like. It was a bit larger than a head, mostly painted black. In the brochures, it had few flashing lights and displays and was always in row after row in these huge brain farms. Safe and secure for life was the motto of New You, the company that looked after his brain. It was a good company. Jim investigated it for years before making the leap. They had been in business for over a decade when Jim started looking into them. No fires, no major loss of life before or after neural encasement, no power outages, quadruple backup, and everything was locked down like a fortress. It seemed foolproof. How did the Jonah collapse even reach them? Of course, Jim knew how it reached them. He was an accountant for 63 years. He knew how the world worked. Even a fortress needs guards, and those guards need money. And there was no money, or at least there wasn't when it could have saved New U. Maybe there was money now. Maybe the world was run by golden unicorns that farted diamonds. All that Jim knew was that he was stuck in darkness. He had to be alive, as if he wasn't, this was the strangest hell he ever heard of. There was a fire. Jim struggled to remember the details of the fire. Even the memory of something terrifying and horrible was better than the non-existence he had now. Jim thought back to the medieval battlefield, the one he used to frequent with a few of his fellow New U head boys. Head boys is what his fellow neural encasements like to call themselves. Of course, the meat space kids call them bucket geezers. Man, he loved to pwn those kids. It literally filled him with so much pleasure to make an 11-year-old cry and rage quit. What was wrong with him? Here he was, a respectable accountant, well into his 80s, just filled with joy at making some obnoxious child cry. Jim wondered if any of those kids hunted down the now likely abandoned New U building just to urinate on the forgotten bucket geezers trapped in their offline coffins. Somebody could be peeing on him right now. And his neural encasement was a grave. A very quiet grave. Actually a bit worse, as he couldn't even claw at the inside of the coffin. But at least he could breathe. Or, not breathe. It wasn't like he was in any pain. It was amazing how well the neural encasement was keeping him alive, albeit in this terrible darkness. Between the electronics and the gel involved, New U said it was likely people could survive for 100 years, even if the power went out. All the benefits of suspended animation with full consciousness. What a tagline. But it wasn't supposed to be 100 years cut off from the world. Jim thought, as many people who get stuck in a terrible situation do, was it his fault? Did he earn this himself? He wasn't exactly a saint, but pragmatism wouldn't let him accept the blame. After all, if he accepted the blame, it would mean that he had some measure of control, and he knew he didn't. This was so far out of his control it was laughable. He was a leaf in the wind with as much control as any leaf has in a passing storm. He was nothing. He wished he was to blame. If he was to blame, that would mean he had some control. Well, maybe there was one thing he could have done. Before the Jonah collapse, a few of the head boys decided to leave New U and set up their own server farm. Jacob and Matthew bought into a co-op that was supposed to be capable of maintaining the neural encasements off the grid. They wanted to be sure they'd be safe when the world economy collapsed. They tried to get Jim on board, but doing so meant breaking ties with New U entirely. They had to sue for control over their brains as well as the trust that maintained them. That wasn't something you could go back on. It was biting the hand that feeds you. New U, in a very polite and lawyer-speak-filled notice, let everybody know that if they left, no neural encasement company would do business with them again. And when you're just a brain in a jar, that's some serious Jim stuck in with New U, as did thousands of other head boys. It was a ship that could not sink. Yes, apparently, just like the Titanic. Jim struggled to get his thoughts in a row again. What was he thinking about? Every time his thoughts drifted, he felt his sanity slip away. Jim concentrated as hard as he could. What was he thinking about before? Oh yeah, the night of the fire. The medieval battle. News of the riots had reached the residents of New U, but it wasn't anything new. Talk about riots was common, but after New U laid down a law about people trying to leave, it was spoken of in hushed tones and well outside of the ears of New U employees. Nobody wanted to get kicked out by New U. There were only 2 other companies in business that still hosted neural encasements. Nobody wanted to get their brain jars tossed down the trash. You certainly couldn't get your family to take your encasement. New U was always happy to remind people that neural encasements needed experienced personnel to maintain. It wasn't like any old friend or family could keep you alive in one. Or at least that's what they said, and they helped write some laws to enforce that. Due to some possibly criminal lobbying, you had to have a special medical license to host a neural encasement. No, Jim thought. Saying it was probably a crime was giving the neural hosting companies too much credit. It was a crime. Neural encasements were meant to be foolproof ways to keep people's brains alive. Taking care of a goldfish required more responsibility. Jim's case had been damaged and clearly abandoned for God knows how long. Any child could keep a grandmother or grandpa alive and ticking. This was a case of big business screwing over the little guy. Again, Jim wanted to rage, but couldn't. This was his life now, just rage and contemplation in the dark. Again, Jim struggled to clarify his thoughts. The inky darkness and isolation made that so hard. What was he thinking about again? The medieval battlefield? The night of the fire? Did he have a longsword and a shield, or a polearm? Jim tried to focus on his memory. It was a sword and a broken shield. Yes, that was it. The battle was starting to turn against his team. He had already been run through and decapitated twice. Those damn kids called their whole team the Geezer Slayers. Man, he wanted to teabag that banner, little bastards. Jim's team won pretty often. One advantage of playing with older players is the years of real-world tactical experience you can find. A few actual military commanders, some retired SWAT members, they had years of experience to crush those rude kids with. Usually Jim's team would have dominated the battlefield quickly, but that day the old military commander Jim's team relied on was off flying on Mars or something. Maybe it was cheating, having actual military-trained players in a military game, but it felt so damn good making those kids rage quit. God, I've been so petty, Jim tried to say, but of course he couldn't. No mouth. Jim was just about to run through one of the little brats named Old Man Sphere with his sword when an alert popped up in front of all the new U players online at the time. 404 network error, preparing full disconnect. What the hell did that mean? It didn't take long to find out. Everyone on Jim's team popped offline into the lobby room. Ed, aka Cheeky Monkey, was the first one hit. He started to spaz out like he was having a stroke. Nobody was certain what to do. Several people tried to summon the admin, but the floating comm screens all showed 404 errors. Then Rick, aka Ladies Man 505, dropped next. 404 and 505, it was like some conspiracy of numbers. One by one, over half the head boys in the room dropped and did the death shuffle. It was only when the message "Fire Retention Engaged" appeared in front of everyone that it became clear what was happening. They were burning to death. Jim hadn't felt so helpless in a long time. There was that bar fight, but even then he still attempted to run away. He couldn't run away from this. No, the last time he felt that help was when his mother and father were in that car accident. They were 3 states away and in the hospital when he heard. His mother died at 11 p.m., his father at 2. That was the last time he felt that helpless. Some of the remaining players in the lobby cried and others screamed for help, but no help came. They were trapped in that room, not that it mattered. Even if the virtual bodies could flee, it wouldn't move their brains' cases an inch. One by one they dropped, flailed, and died. Their corpses didn't go limp as a real-life body might, but instead stayed frozen at the moment of the neural encasement's complete failure, their avatars frozen in horror. This went on for hours, or maybe it was minutes. No, Jim thought, it couldn't have been hours. He struggled to figure out how long the horror show lasted. It had to have been less than 10 minutes, he was certain. It just felt like the longest eternity. A few people tried to prepare themselves for their final death. They dropped to their knees and prayed. It didn't stop them from eventually convulsing. One by one, without any consideration for age or race or even common decency, they fell. The good ones, the bad ones. They all knew the fire was sweeping from one side of the building to the other, but it wasn't like anyone knew where their neural encasement was. Finally, it just came down to Jim, Nancy, and Lawrence. Lawrence just put on a strong face and said, "See you on the other side, brother." Nancy was on the floor crying. Jim was just frozen. He stood there with the same clueless look he had when his parents were dying, unable to move, unable to think. He didn't have any fine or noble last words. Damn Lawrence showing him up right until the end. Why didn't he have anything cool to say? And then darkness. Finally, Jim felt a sense of accomplishment. As sad and horrible as that memory was, he was able to keep his thoughts together and coherent long enough to have it. He wasn't gone yet. This small accomplishment meant something. It meant that his mind still worked, and that through all of the delusions and dreams he still existed. He would have patted himself on the back if he had a back to pat. Jim wanted to do a celebratory yes for this minor mental accomplishment, but all he could do was imagine himself doing it. Suddenly a ray of light appeared, and despite having no eyes, he felt blind. Was this another delusion? Was fate robbing him of his tiny victory by showing him he wasn't really staving off insanity? No, Jim thought. Keep it together. It's not real. But then a muffled voice boomed all around him. It was so loud that he thought his non-existent ears were going to explode. The sound was so painful, Jim wondered if maybe it was the voice of God calling him to heaven or hell. But it sounded like ruff, ruff, ruff. Did God have a speech impediment? But then the voice cleared up. The volume came down to something closer to a jet engine instead of a nuclear bomb, and the voice said, "Hey, Bucket Geezer, are you in there?" In that moment, if Jim had eyes, he would have cried.